Hyvää huomenta. In case that made no sense whatsoever, good morning. It's an honor and pleasure to speak before you today. When I was preparing for today's address, I came across a saying that provided me some valuable insight into Finnish culture and society. Niin metsä vasta, kuin sinne huudetaan. The forest answers in the same way one shouts to it. I interpret it as you reap what you sow, a highly topical saying given the subject of today's summit and my opening remarks. Finnish people seem to have an almost mythical bond with nature and the ecosystems around them. I found at least 8 different ancient Finnish deities representing different aspects of nature. And this bond between the Finns and the natural world is still very strong today. A survey conducted in 2021 found that 87% of Finns consider nature very important in their lives, as it provides them with something no euro coin or note can do: intangible well-being. Peace of mind, recreation, energy, recuperation, relaxation. The list goes on. But more than half of the survey's respondents said that they were concerned about the state of nature in their country. Had I been surveyed about the state of nature in the Netherlands, I would have said the same thing. Humanity is asking too much of nature, and we are crossing planetary boundaries at an alarming speed. There are 9 natural processes that are critical for maintaining the stability and resilience of the Earth. For 6 of them, we are exceeding our planet's safe operating limits. As a consequence, we increasingly run the risks of going over the Earth's tipping points. Beyond those tipping points, we should expect irreversible damage. We are degrading nature and biodiversity at an unprecedented rate. Just a few examples. Wildlife populations have declined by almost 70% since 1970. And the global rate of species extinction is now tens to hundreds of times higher than it has been in the last 10 million years. We have been yelling at our forests, our seas, our mountains, at the living and non-living elements on our planet. And they have answered in ways we should be gravely concerned about. Not just because living in harmony with nature gives us all those great things you enjoy here in Finland, but also because we care about economic and financial stability. We depend on nature for food, medicine, energy, clean air and water, security from natural disasters, recreation and cultural inspiration. Our economies rely on nature. As ECB board member Frank Elderson remarked earlier this year, destroy nature and you destroy the economy. 2 weeks ago, the ECB published a paper in which it concluded that almost 75% of corporate bank loans in the euro area are granted to corporations that are highly dependent on at least one direct contribution from an ecosystem, a so-called ecosystem service. This dependence could result in significant losses for banks if nature continues to deteriorate. Finnish corporations, the study finds, are among the most dependent on ecosystem services, and more than 85% of loans from Finnish banks are highly dependent on nature. The president of the Dutch central bank, Klaas Knot, has said that when it comes to solving the climate and nature crisis, central banks and supervisors may not be in the driver's seat, as that's where elected officials should sit, but that we are definitely part of the team. Nature degradation and the financial risks associated with it are squarely within our mandate. Today, I want to talk to you about what our community of central banks and supervisors is doing to address this huge challenge, and about what I think the financial sector can and must do. The Network for Greening the Financial System, or NGFS, is an organization made up of 127 central banks and supervisors, including the Central Bank of Finland and the Netherlands. Because we need a global approach to address sustainability-related challenges. They do not stop at our country's borders. With this in mind, the NGFS focuses on topics that are crucial to central banks and supervisors around the world, providing expertise, capability building support, and training. In 2022, it established a task force to integrate nature-related risks in all its activities. And last September, this task force published a conceptual framework to give the financial ecosystem a common language and to help it understand the material risks it runs as a result of nature degradation. Like climate-related risks, nature-related risks come in two categories. First, the degradation of nature and loss of ecosystem services pose physical risks. Second, there are transition risks, which are the result of a misalignment of economic actors with measures to protect, restore, or reduce negative impacts on nature. These risks can have economic consequences, both on a micro and macro level, that should be of concern to the financial sector, as they could ultimately threaten the continuity of individual financial institutions or even destabilize the entire financial system. But I also have to point out that financial institutions are not just victims here. They have an impact on nature-related risks they need to manage. For instance, through the economic activities they finance. The conceptual NGFS framework will help us streamline the analysis of nature-related risks and identify appropriate measures. It has also revealed the need for scenarios to facilitate forward-looking risk assessments. Such a scenario could, for instance, help a financial institution understand what the multi-year consequences of a nature-related transition policy could be. Less than a month from now, the NGFS task force will publish a technical document with specific recommendations for the development of these kinds of nature-related scenarios. And going forward, we will continue to explore how efforts to bridge data gaps, for instance, through disclosure guidelines, frameworks, and standards created by stakeholders such as the TNFD and ISSB, can strengthen and supplement our work. Individual central banks and supervisors are also increasingly recognizing nature-related risks as a key theme. The Dutch Central Bank, DNB, was one of the first of its peers to explicitly identify biodiversity loss as a potential driver of financial risk in its 2020 report, Indebted to Nature. In this report, we analyzed the total exposure of financial institutions and the potential impact of biodiversity loss on the economy and the financial system. That same year, the ECB published a guide on climate-related and environmental risks in which it set supervisory expectations related to risk management and disclosure. Because as supervisors of financial institutions, our primary concern is prudent risk management. The ECB guide sets out good practices on topics like business models, strategy, governance, risk appetite, risk management, and disclosures. After concluding in 2022 that the sector was still by no means adequately managing these risks, the ECB set staggered deadlines for banks to progressively meet all supervisory expectations at the end of 2024. If these deadlines are not met, enforcement action could be taken. At DNB, we followed the ECB's example and published a similar guide for the insurers, pension funds, and other non-bank financial institutions that we supervise. Because we are committed to including climate and environmental risk management in our standard supervision. We also regularly try to paint a more macro-prudential picture by doing stress tests and scenario analyses, which we publish about in our Financial Stability Review or in occasional studies. Finally, we use our influence in various international forums to advance the development of standards and supervisory instruments for the identification and assessment of sustainability risks. These forums include the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision, the European Banking Authority, the European Insurance and Occupational Pensions Authority, and the Financial Stability Board. So at a minimum, we expect the financial sector to manage its nature-related risks appropriately. And you can expect us to provide clear guidelines and standards to adhere to. But I believe that our mandate stretches beyond just ensuring sound risk management. The EMB is also an economic advisor. We believe that sustainability is a topic that requires a fact-based, long-term, and integrated perspective. This means that we clearly set out the trade-offs between climate, nature, and other sustainability considerations in our analysis of policy options, by painting a long-term picture that shows more than just a single electoral cycle. We accumulate and analyze data, cooperating internationally through the European Central Bank or the Financial Stability Board where possible. And based on our data analysis, we advise our governments and policymakers. After all, they are the ones in the driver's seat. They have the political power to shape our societies. Similarly, the NGFS provides perspectives on certain topics to enhance sustainable finance solutions. A forthcoming NGFS publication on blended finance illustrates how the risk-return relationship of investment projects can be improved, thereby unlocking private capital that can help bridge the existing climate and nature finance gap. DNB also keeps sustainability on the agenda in the financial ecosystem by hosting the Secretariat of the Dutch Sustainable Finance Platform. Through this platform, the Dutch financial sector regularly meets with DNB, the Financial Markets Authority, ministries and think tanks to discuss matters of shared interest with the goal of supporting and enhancing the Netherlands' sustainability efforts. And of course, we try to practice what we preach in how we operate as an organization. For instance, when it comes to our own investments. In 2019, DNB became the first central bank to sign the Principles for Responsible Investment. At the moment, we are also conducting a pilot to explore how the TNFD framework could apply to DNB's own reserves. And in renovating our headquarters in the center of Amsterdam, we made as many sustainable choices as possible. For example, by making the old concrete carbon neutral, by injecting it with CO2, and making room for plenty of greenery in and around the building. Now, as a supervisor, it's not up to me to tell you who you should or should not lend to. But I believe that there is a lot of willingness among private financial institutions to contribute to a sustainable future. The sustainability transition needs to be funded, and the financial sector has an important role to play. It can help achieve us carbon-neutral societies that exist in harmony with nature. Investing or lending to create sustainable impact, I believe, is the wave of the future. I understand that stepping away from the traditional risk-return framework may be scary, and that it may feel like you are not delivering on your promise to maximize financial value for your shareholders. But more and more shareholders, as well as clients, are realizing the accelerating importance of sustainability. As a Dutch pension fund says on its website, "What's the use of a good pension if the world around you has become unlivable? And could we not argue that it is actually a long-term value optimization decision to include sustainable impact in investment decisions to make your business model future-proof? And isn't it possible that impact-driven financing will actually help you manage your sustainability-related risks? Sure, it will require some work on your part. Just some non-exhaustive examples. First of all, your operational primary processes, like investment processes and customer acceptance, will need to be tailored towards impact investments. Second, you will need to attract the right people. And the KPIs that you base your reward decisions on will need to reflect your commitment to value impact. And third, you need to become more transparent about what you do and what you are aiming for, to move away from the current short-term focus towards a long-term vision centered around sustainability. Of course, you cannot do this alone. You can expect policymakers, supervisors, and regulators to support your transition towards a more impact-oriented mindset, while also bearing in mind your prudent risk management, I care to say. Together, paving the way for a smooth, predictable transition with clearly defined roles and expectations for everyone involved. But I also urge you not to wait for everything to be perfect or for all the necessary data to be available. Because if we wait too long, we might simply be too late. That is what we can do. We can be in the team that drives the transition towards sustainable societies and a sustainable future. So that when our children and grandchildren ask us what we did to save the planet, we can say that we stopped yelling at our forests and started listening to them. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, and the honor is also mine to be here in Finland. My sense is that the finance, business community and also the government now, I hear the Prime Minister is really leading on this area. I thank you for your leadership and also honored to follow Marc Reinke in the leadership of the NGFS and indeed DNB on this topic also. And DNB as the first central bank to be pilot testing the TNFD framework. Thank you very much for all of your willingness to test and provide us with feedback. So I hope in the corridors as I came in, a colleague said to me that here in Finland, there are not many who are not yet recognizing that this is an important area, but there are many who are hungry for how to get started and how to put this into practice. So I hope my presentation will give you a flavor of a way to do that. So I will briefly introduce the topic. I think I follow in the footsteps of the previous speakers who've made a very strong case for why this is a strategic risk management issue. I'll then move into some details of what the Taskforce on Nature-related Financial Disclosures is and what we just released. So we just had a major milestone in September of this year when we released our recommended disclosures and a set of guidance to accompany that, as well as a measurement framework. So I only have half an hour, but I will give you a whistle-stop tour of the recommendations and this framework to help you get started, and if you're already started, to help you increase your ambition over time. But before I dig into the details, to complement our previous speakers, the case for action is very clear. This was something I worked on previous to TNFD on the Dasgupta review, which was an independent global review commissioned by the UK Economics and Finance Ministry on biodiversity, which showed that in many ways we're living in the best of times, where we have increases in average income, life expectancy, the reduction in absolute poverty, and mortality rates. We must all recognize we're living in, for many, the best of times. But we also know from the data, which has been presented already on loss of biodiversity and on natural capital depletion, that it is also in many ways the worst of times. And the way that we have developed has come at the expense of nature, with extinction rates between 100 and 1,000 times higher than the baseline rate, and those rates are increasing, and living through what scientists tell us is the 6th global extinction. So we're living in this era of the Anthropocene, and Marc also mentioned these global planetary boundaries which are being breached, which show that we are exiting the stable state we had for 11,000 years of the Holocene, entering a new era where humanity's impact on the planet is its most significant driver. And it's in this context of the real we have the hockey stick image from carbon and climate, but actually if you look more broadly at other geochemical signatures, things like soil nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon dioxide and methane and it seems very appropriate here in Finland, in sediments and ice cores, we can see that it's really since the middle of last century, 1950, and then a marked increase in all of these drivers of change. And so in the context of measuring this in terms of natural capital, what we can see is that our demands on nature are vastly greater than its ability to continue to supply the services on which we rely. And while produced capital has increased and human capital has increased, natural capitals in this period since 1992 has markedly decreased. And so we're reducing and degrading the assets on which we rely. And it was in this context that the Dasgupta review set out that we need to change how we think, how we act, and how we measure success. And it provided a portfolio of recommendations, but one of the major recommendations in its third category was about transforming our institutions, and in particular transforming our financial systems to disclose, to assess, and to manage these risks that Marc eloquently laid out. And so, since the Dasgupta review, there has been increasing recognition from central banks and supervisors, also from policymakers, but also from global leaders in business and finance, that having breached these 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, environmental and climate risks connected to these are some of the greatest risks we face over the next decade, but they are also some of the risks for which we are seen to be least prepared. And that was the finding of the most recent World Economic Forum risk report. And in this context, in understanding how we depend on nature for these services that it supplies, we realize that cash flows are intrinsically connected to environmental flows or environmental services from nature to business. And so as we see accelerating nature loss, we see investor expectations increasing for the disclosure and management of these risks, and that the resilience of our economies, of our societies, is ultimately, and the prosperity indeed of our societies is ultimately deeply interconnected to the resilience and health of nature. And in this context, we have been delighted to see the leadership of NGFS and DNB in this area to recognize this as a financial stability risk, while I have been working on an initiative coming from the financial institution and corporate perspective, who were at the frontiers indeed of seeing some of these risks, both physical and transition risk, and recognizing the need to take action. And a number of investors are now signaling their expectations for action from their investees and their clients. Here we have statements from BlackRock, from Norges Bank Investment Management, the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, and Aviva Investors, about their recognition that their portfolios are exposed to risks stemming from nature and biodiversity loss, and increasingly setting expectations that there should be disclosure of this from their clients, their existing and future clients. In this context, it was a pleasure to begin work a little over 2 years ago with the Taskforce on nature-related financial disclosures. This is a market-led initiative, a financial task force. You can see the names of the members. We have 40 task force members. They're a mix of financial institutions, corporates, and service providers globally. We're government supported, so we're part of the G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap, supported by the G7. But also, very important to my role as technical director is to ensure that science basis. So working with knowledge partners from around the world, and one of our 19 knowledge partners has been the NGFS, for which we are very grateful, bringing together our definitions and our concepts so that our conceptual frameworks are harmonized from the prudential through to the institution level perspectives. So we have had, we're just updating our mission statement because we actually have made great progress in achieving it. It was to develop and deliver a nature-related risk management and disclosure framework, which we published in September. So our mission is about to be updated. We'll focus on encouraging and enabling the uptake of this framework to improve and to shift, improve decision-making and shift global financial flows away from activities that are harming nature and towards those that help it thrive. So there's a little context on the big picture and about TNFD. I now want to take you under the hood of what we just published in September. And at the sort of very center, maybe a pyramid is the wrong shape, but the very sort of heart of what we produced is at the top of the pyramid, which is a set of recommendations from the market to the market about what should be disclosed. So those are TNFD's recommendations. But underneath that, we went much further indeed than our sister organization, inspired by the Climate Task Force, the TCFD, in producing a large set of guidance which helps organizations to get started, to see how this translates to specific sectors, including financial institutions, but also a range of real economy sectors that have significant impacts and dependencies on nature, through to different types of ecosystem, because nature, unlike climate mitigation, is very location specific. So your impacts and dependencies in forests will be very different from the deep ocean, from a river or a lake, through to guidance on technical topics, which we will continue to update around scenario analysis and how to do integrated scenarios for nature and climate, target setting, and engagement, which is particularly important for nature because it's location specific. So those local communities and indeed indigenous peoples often will be best placed to understand and to solve the risks that are identified. So there's a rich set of material. Please don't be overwhelmed, but it enables you to navigate, to get started, and to dig deeper as you move into understanding the issue. And it's been a real pleasure to work on building on the foundations that have been developed over several decades. So I know for many, nature is a new topic, but there's been a strong community of organizations, many of whom are shown here, that have been working on this, that we've been able to build on. And that's how we've been able to do this so quickly, is to build on, for example, the Natural Capital Protocol for how you do impact and dependency analysis, the work of the NGFS for our risk definitions, the UN Statistical Standard for Ecosystem Accounting, which is the basis of many of our concepts and definitions. And it's been a hugely collaborative process to pull this together. So we have actually 240 organizations who are pilot testing, which has enabled us to get that bridge between providing a credible, science-based framework, but that will also be practical and easy to apply for financial institutions and corporates. And we followed an approach which is known in software as open innovation, which to implement was tough. We had to run very fast, but it meant we had put things out which we felt were good enough for feedback continuously over the last 2 years. And this has been a very, very powerful process for rapidly increasing uptake and understanding. And for many organizations now, although we only published our final recommendations in September, there are many organizations who are now quite mature in their assessments and already starting to publish integrated TNFD and TCFD disclosures. And so looking to the path of how climate disclosures have taken off with TCFD's publication of the equivalent of our recommendations back in 2017, we foresee the same three pathways, not necessarily sequential in all jurisdictions, for how these disclosures will start to move into adoption. The first pathway is through voluntary adoption, and TNFD is a market-led voluntary initiative. So we're here to support organizations to voluntarily start taking action. But we also already see and look forward to continue to work with the global standards developers, because we are not a standard, we're a framework, we're a set of recommendations from the market. So we're working with the global standards organizations, in particular, the International Sustainability Standards Board, who will be setting that global baseline. Also the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, who are looking specifically at impacts. And then at the final level, the level at which this becomes mandatory, the level of regulation, the level of legislation. And indeed what's been, again, challenging but exciting for TNFD is that there's one jurisdiction in which those regulations have been developing at the same time as the framework. So in Europe, we now have the CSRD and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. So we've been working very closely with EFRAG, the Financial Regulation Advisory Group in Europe, to create that consistency in the conceptual framework and to add value in providing practical guidance from TNFD, which is then signposted from the regulations in Europe. And so we see this cascade. It won't necessarily happen linearly, from the Global Biodiversity Framework, which sets those global goals and targets, through to TNFD as a risk management and disclosure framework, and also the Science-Based Targets Network, which is the equivalent of the SBTI, through to those standards and through to those regulations, and importantly, most importantly, through to all of you in preparing and using those reports. So we're delighted. We've been working closely with these organizations for the last 2 years for the recognition of this consistency. We know from the market you do not want many different regulations that create a huge burden for compliance. So to create this consistency, the recognition that the TNFD recommendations is consistent with that global baseline that ISSB is developing, GRI standards for impacts, and CDP is now working closely with us to update their questionnaires for that consistency with the TNFD framework. And critically, of course, with the global goals, and there is Target 15 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which sets out that the nearly 200 governments who are signed up to the CBD should be encouraging and enabling moving large multinationals and financial institutions towards disclosure of their impacts, dependencies, and risks, which is exactly what the TNFD framework is set up to do. And I always like, before I go under the hood, to talk about materiality, the M word, because we always get asked about this. TNFD is a global initiative. We're established to enable financial institutions and corporates all over the world to look at these issues. And we now know that in different jurisdictions, different approaches to materiality are folded in. And so we've created an assessment framework and a set of disclosures which can follow both financial materiality and impact materiality, recognizing that consistency with the ISSB baseline, so looking at risk management in terms of how dependencies and impacts create risks and opportunities to the organization, but also enabling organizations that may choose or be required to look at impact more broadly for wider stakeholders to use the same framework. And we clearly set out how the assessment framework we set out fits into these two sets of building blocks. So under the hood, as I said, at the top of this pyramid is a set of recommended disclosures. There are 14, and they follow exactly the same structure, language, and approach as the TCFD. And we've done this by design, not by accident, because we know from the market that just tackling climate has been a journey, that people are increasingly, organizations and the science increasingly recognize the need to look at climate and nature in an integrated way. So we took the same 4 pillars of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. Our only extension has been add impact management in the third pillar to recognize the relevance of impacts and dependencies when thinking about these issues. And we've carried over the 11 TCFD disclosures, of course thinking carefully about how, by extension, this expands through to nature. Some are quite easy, for example, with governance. The board oversight and the management's quite easy to translate from climate and nature. Some are harder. Scenario analysis, we have no equivalent of 1.5 degrees. We have no one metric, so that's required some more thought by design. But the basic language and structure is the same to help those integrated disclosures. And we then have 3 new disclosures where, when we thought deeply and consulted deeply to think about nature beyond climate mitigation, you need to think about, in particular, engagement with those local communities and indigenous peoples to have a meaningful assessment, meaningful disclosure. You need to think about your value chains. Of course, we're already doing that for climate with Scope 3, but for ours, we have pulled out direct operations and upstream and downstream disclosures separately, recognizing for financial institutions, for many sectors like agriculture, upstream or indeed downstream may be where your most material issues lie, but they can be where the data and the analysis can still be quite challenging. And finally, looking at location. So the big additional lens over everything with nature is where. Where are these activities taking place? Where are your assets that may have impacts and dependencies? Because your interaction in one water basin with large water usage may be far less risky in a water basin, a watershed with plentiful water supply, than in one under water stress. So this understanding of location is critical. And so underlying those 14 disclosures, which at its essence, those 14 disclosures sit at the heart of what we've produced, is a conceptual framework, which is really quite intuitive and simple. It's how do businesses impact on nature. Those impacts can be both negative, and unfortunately that's been the path over time, we can see from the data, but they can also be positive through regeneration, through conservation, through restoration, and through mitigating your negative impacts. They can also, and also critically, these dependencies, which has not been something we have always looked at with a close lens so far, but that creates this feedback loop. As you're depending on nature and impacting on it, it creates risks and opportunities to your organization. And in looking through this, and it came up in conversations earlier today, what we were missing for nature was a measurement framework. So we have no equivalent of the greenhouse gas protocol. So we had to not only create the recommended disclosures, but also a measurement framework that could be used for the metrics and target setting that would allow that comparability and consistency, which we know investors need, both across sectors and within sectors. And we began by doing a large landscape assessment of what already existed in GRI, in CDP, in SASB, in many of these existing standards. We got to 3,000 metrics, at which point I told the team to stop counting. I thought we had probably most down and said, right, this work with the task force, this is not what the market needs, but we can surely create a funnel to create a consistent yet flexible framework for measurement. We spotted many gaps, just like conceptually in the measurement, there were fewer metrics and indicators around dependencies, and no standardized way for nature to think about risks and opportunities, although much that we could learn from climate and other areas. So we took that landscape assessment and we started to think about a measurement framework, not only for disclosure, but also for internal assessment. Because for many organizations, before you get to disclosure, you need to be doing this internal assessment. So we've created a framework called the LEAP approach, which walks you through how to locate your interface with nature, evaluate those dependencies and impacts, assess your risks and opportunities, and then prepare to respond and report. So we've developed a flexible measurement approach with indicators for each of those phases and components, as well as a very specific set of recommended metrics for disclosure. And in doing that, we were trying to create something equivalent to a leading indicators set, like you would have for financial reporting in balance sheets or profit and loss statements, or indeed for macroeconomic reporting with GDP and inflation. What would be those leading indicators so we can get to a smaller set? We know you don't want 3,000 Some of you may want to have one. Sorry, you're not going to get one. But how do we funnel this to create this consistency? And this was, I think, the most interesting, probably the most challenging aspect of what we produced. And as we got to disclosure, we created a 3-tiered measurement architecture. And this is ultimately to address 2 primary concerns. One is to create that comparability for investors across organizations, but also flexibility, because we know that a particular organization in the agriculture sector compared to one in mining and metals and geographical differences will mean that you may want nuance as you engage and have deeper discussions with the corporates that you're investing in. So that led us to having a small set of core global metrics. That's for that cross-sector comparability. I'll show those to you in a moment. Smaller sets of core sector metrics, knowing that particular issues will be pertinent for one sector. And then additional metrics, knowing that all organizations are different. There may be flexibility where organizations may choose to disclose something unique to them. And so these first 2 categories, the core metrics, are on a comply or explain basis to create that consistency, but then the flexibility to disclose other material issues and indicators as the organization sees fit. And so those core global indicators are often of much interest. I thought I would share them briefly here. They've been selected because they apply across business models to most sectors, just like greenhouse gas emissions reporting. And they're included in a lot of detail in our annex, but I thought I'd give you a flavor of them. So there are 9 relating to dependencies and impacts. That's where a lot of existing market practice currently sits. And 5 relating to risks and opportunities. And these have been modeled and built out from the ISSB's climate disclosure metrics for S2 standard. So this gives you a flavor of those core indicators. They're organized around the 5 drivers of nature change. So we know from IPBES, which is the equivalent of the IPCC, that there are 5 drivers of nature change. Climate change has been our focus. We introduce the other 4. We're looking at land, freshwater and ocean use change, pollution, resource use, and invasive alien species. And importantly, we're also starting to encourage organizations to look at outcomes, not only drivers, but the equivalent of that temperature change from greenhouse gas emissions, what would be changes in ecosystem condition and health and species abundance and risk. These bottom in green are called placeholders because the state of the science on invasive alien species and state of nature measurement is still coming to consistency and agreement with the scientists. So that's where we're encouraging organizations to get started, but acknowledging that there is still an area of exploration. So we hope to update this when we update our metrics framework in a few years. And then these are the 5 risk and opportunity metrics, looking at the value of a range of categories that are assessed as vulnerable to transition risk and physical risk, the areas that Marc mentioned, as well as looking at a number of other metrics, particularly the task force felt important to look at opportunity as well as risk. We also have acknowledged that for financial institutions, there are particular data challenges. As TNFD just begins with, and we hope the corporate reporting will be widespread and rapid. But in the meantime, financial institutions will be reliant on the data from corporates. And so as a near-term set of metrics for financial institutions, we've looked at 2 that we think should be possible right now, based on what we've learned from the pilot testing with heat mapping and initial analysis, to look at financial exposure to a defined set of sectors, and we set out those sectors that have very high material dependencies and impacts, and activities in sensitive locations, and we give a set of criteria for what those are. Things like areas of high biodiversity importance, or rapid decline in ecosystem integrity, which will create that exposure to elevated risks. And these, I should say, are still in draft. We plan to finalize those in the spring and welcome feedback. What we're trying to do is bridge that challenge for financial institutions in particular to get started. So those are the recommended disclosures, the metrics architecture. I thought I'd just conclude with just a flavor of the additional guidance, which enables organizations to get started. So as I mentioned, we have the LEAP approach. This is almost like a a manual, a full manual of how you can go through from assessment. It's suggested, it's not required to do TNFD disclosures, but it includes a range of case studies, signposts to data, signposts to tools, which we hope organisations will find is useful. And it's been done on that extensive feedback and pilot testing. So we have case studies that come from the pilots, store brand, Nestlé, AXA, others who have pilot tested the framework to bring it to life, and we'll continue to build that bank of case studies over time. We also, to complement that, have a much shorter guidance, which is how to get started. And our biggest message, as we now have launched the recommendations, is just get started. You don't need to be able to do all 14 disclosures. You don't need to be able to do everything. Just begin. And so this guidance includes quite common sense, but we hope helpful advice, learning from pilot testing about how to begin. Things like beginning with what you already have, leveraging existing work for climate, which can often have significant overlap for what would be needed for nature, as well as building the business case to get that buy-in from your board and senior management. So to conclude, we undertook a survey of about 240 organizations in the summer to understand their expectations about when and what they would begin to disclose against the TNFD framework. Encouragingly, we found that roughly 70% of those who responded plan to report in their financial year 2025 or earlier, and 86% by their financial year 2026 and earlier, which is very encouraging. You can see the grey bars are the corporates, yellow financial institutions, so slightly higher expectation among corporates. And on the right, you can see the pattern of where organizations are beginning to expect to start disclosing. Most are expecting to disclose roughly half, so about 7 of the 14 to begin with, broadly starting with governance, and then slightly lower, but you can see quite a disparate array of other types of disclosures, depending on the type of organization they are. So this has been very encouraging for us. And on that basis, we now have an adopters campaign. So we'd really encourage all organizations here to consider being part of the early adopters. We'll be announcing a set of organizations that are at that frontier in Davos in January. You can register on our website with the intent to report for your financial year 24 or 25 outcomes. That will remain confidential unless you wish to make that public earlier, and then we will publish that list at Davos. And we hope this will give that sense of momentum. It's not to set all expectations that what happens early next year is the end game. We know for many this will take months and years to put into practice. But we hope it will give that sense of momentum, that sense of possibility, building on all the work that's been done on pilot testing for the last 2 years. So I hope many of you will be interested. I'll be here for the rest of the day and look forward to speaking with you about what may be possible here in Finland. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Good morning, everybody. It is a real pleasure for me to be here today, to see so many of you ready to engage on this really important topic. I think in the investor community, it is definitely becoming a lot more topical. You definitely hear a lot more people talking about biodiversity and nature these days, which was not really the case, I would argue, even 12, 18 months ago. So I'm proud to say that we're one of the early starters in this particular field. We've spent a lot of time doing research, and it's great to be able to share some of our findings and challenges, if you like, with you. And really, I can think of no better place than Finland to have this conversation. The Nordic region is very close to my heart. It was the first place that I visited meeting clients when I got the job at JP Morgan. And it's also a leading region where investors here really put sustainable investing into practice. So I come back here every year to meet with like-minded investors and clients whom I have the privilege to serve and maintain a long-standing relationship with. My job as the global head of sustainable investing in an asset manager really is to help our clients to achieve their sustainable investing objectives. So to do my job, I need to stay on top of anything that could impact our clients' investment portfolios. If you think about the issues that we've been really focusing a lot on is in the last, I would say, 5 years is really around climate change. Climate change will continue to be a focus for us because of its associated risks and opportunities and how significant they are. But there is a new frontier in sustainable investing, and that is nature, what we're talking about today. It is, unfortunately, and you've heard from many of the other presenters, how nature is in a warring state. And that's why I think investors are increasingly focusing on the potential risks that we're not really familiar with. So I'm going to quote you some stats here, just to illustrate the way we see how big of an issue it is potentially for our investments. According to the United Nations Environmental Program, 75% of the Earth's land surface and 66% of ocean areas have already been significantly impacted by human activities in a negative way. How? 1 million out of 8 million of the world's species are now threatened with extinction. And did you know that we are using the equivalent, and this stats really shocked me, we're using the equivalent of 1.6 Earth every year just to sustain our current way of living. Clearly, that is not sustainable. Emily mentioned just now how 6 out of the 9 planetary boundaries have been breached, according to the latest scientific results. And it includes things like loss of biodiversity, land system change, and freshwater change. I think what's really, really worrying is that we can't even quantify the full potential impact of what these breaches mean to economic growth or even the survivability of humankind. So yes, there is a lot of interest and awareness of how dire the situation is, but we still saw last year deforestation globally went up by 4%. And I think the last thing I will mention is that what is still not known to many is the close interlink between loss of biodiversity, destruction of nature, and climate change. Global warming is actually accelerating the loss of biodiversity and the ecosystem, broadly speaking. So we have to do something about it. It's not because we are good people. I want to believe that we're all good people, but it's because nature is the foundation of our economy. I would argue that you cannot have a positive financial future without nature. And that is why it's so important for us as investors to focus on this topic. So now with the concept of investing in climate change solutions very well established, I think this is the time to really put nature into the picture. Some of you may be asking the questions, and we asked the questions ourselves 18 months ago. Why is nature relevant to our investment portfolios? How should we be thinking about it when we make investment decisions? And I think the most important question is, what can we as investors do anything about it? So today I'm going to try to provide some answers to these questions to you based on our own experience. And I think it's been a journey, and we're nowhere near the end of it, but I'm glad to be able to share some of those with you. So let's start with the why. We talked about how nature is the foundation of our economy. It offers us natural capital, which includes species biodiversity and ecosystem services. These two ensure the healthy functioning of our planet and our society. We also need to remember that nature is not a finite resource. It should be viewed as an economic asset like any other asset that we have in our society. And what that means is that if we don't really look after it, nature will deplete like any other asset to the point that it can no longer be useful to us. And almost every sector and industry, if you look at across our economy, is dependent on nature to a certain extent. And there are a few that are 100% reliant on nature. For example, agriculture, fishery, forestry, food and beverages. So we know that they're important, but we don't see nature in our economic equation, right? We don't see it in corporate accounting. we also don't see it in the way we calculate GDP. And that's a big problem as an investor that we're trying to tackle, right? Because we always look at numbers, how we quantify things, and how we discount it at the end of the day so we can put a price on it. So if we don't see that in economic equation, it's very, very hard for us to make investment decision. So how should we be thinking about it then? The way that I would advocate for us to start considering nature is to really get a better understanding of what nature provides to the different industry sectors that we invest in or we participate in as a financial industry, and the risks and opportunities associated with the depletion of nature or the conservation of that natural resources, which is important to those sectors. So just like how we consider climate change, natural disasters present risks of stranded assets. Nature is very similar, so we have to invest sustainably in order to deliver long-term risk-adjusted return. Part of the reason why, and this was mentioned in the previous presentation as well, part of the reason why investors aren't paying enough attention to nature is really because of the complexity of measuring and then also taking investment actions. If we think about mitigating climate change, we understand why we need to decarbonize. We understand how bringing down the greenhouse gas emissions is going to be crucial to slow down global warming. But in the case of nature, it is a lot more complex, right? There isn't a single metric like carbon intensity that we can use to track the status of nature or progress that's being made by companies across any different sectors. And as mentioned, like nature challenges are very location specific, whereas atmospheric greenhouse gas concentration is a global phenomenon. So I think we have to admit that there is still a lot that we don't understand when it comes to biodiversity, nature, and how they interlink with our economic growth. We also found that last year, I think there was a study that shows how only 5% of Fortune 500 companies had actually set quantified targets around nature, comparing to 83% for climate. So I would argue that the work is not just for investors, it's even more important for companies and industries to start measuring and managing nature-related risks and opportunities. So what can we do as investors today, right? As companies start to understand these issues, they can use now newer frameworks to start measuring some of these things. I think for us, the most critical step that we can take is to do engagement, to actively engage with companies that we invest in around nature issues. And it is just not possible to sit back and passively monitor how a company is doing in managing nature-related risks and opportunities, right? It's not like we can look at carbon intensity and then just focus on the trajectory. It doesn't work in this particular aspect because there are multiple different indicators related to different types of nature's resources and services that investors need to be aware of. And then also the threshold that you should assign as a minimum of these could really change depending on the context that a company is operating in. So this is why last year at JP Morgan Asset Management, we added natural capital as one of our global priorities for company engagement. So we do that with companies across the globe where we have investments in across equity and fixed income investment. And we've built out dedicated engagement frameworks on key issues such as water use, plastic pollution. And these are financially material, nature-related issues. And I would say that we've made progress, but there's still a long way for both us as investors and then also portfolio companies as well. The good news is that we don't have to do this alone. Right? We learn a lot from our experience in introducing climate consideration into policies, regulations, corporate disclosure, investment product design, all the way to capital deployment. So nature investing can benefit a lot from this years of work in our community. And on the point of engagement and corporate disclosure, the launch of TNFD recommendation is a great example. It was built on experience of TCFD, as Emily said, so it really saved years of our time to being able to get familiar with the framework and start using it. And you saw how there's now over 1,000 companies as a member of TNFD and JP Morgan Chase being one of those, and over 70% of the companies are ready to potentially start disclosing their data by 2025. In my mind, this could be game-changing. So now we understand why nature matters and how we could be thinking about it. To answer the last questions around what concrete steps that we can take today as investors, I want to recommend 3 steps for investors to consider. And this is really drawing from our own experience. So step 1, identify sectors and industries that are most reliant on nature and have the biggest potential impact on nature. We cannot boil the ocean. Right? All of us have finite resources despite the size of our organizations, and we need to be patient as well. So find the most relevant sectors and industries to start. We recently published a paper on how investors can support nature's adaptation to climate change. And in the paper, we highlighted agriculture, forestry, food and beverages as the top 3 sectors with extremely high dependencies and impact on nature. So we believe that it's really critical for any investors to understand the nature-related risks and opportunities for these 3 sectors. In the paper, we also cover tourism and pharmaceutical industries. They have a more subtle reliance on nature, but it's also very, very crucial as well. And if we look at nature, which is a really broad topic, if we narrow it down and look at land, ocean and species, in the context of water, we believe that water utilities as an industry is really important, and we're doing a lot of engagement work with water utilities around the world on how they're managing water as a natural resource. So that's step 1. Step 2, develop sector or industry-specific scorecards based on the key risks that these industries face and opportunities that each one of them can take. In another paper that we wrote in collaboration with Sweden's AP4 this year, we talked about how to integrate biodiversity-related data and metrics into investment consideration, so that we can really better understand individual companies' operational impacts and dependencies on nature. Our view is that we cannot rely on a single footprint metric. The underlying data is just very limited and not decision useful. And we also believe that it's not quite possible for investors to consider the full biodiversity impact comprehensively, just given of the lack of measurement frameworks and then also limited understanding even by the industries themselves. A lot of the companies that we engage with in the top 3 sectors that I just mentioned are only just starting to understand what nature and biodiversity means to them in their core operations, as well as through to their supply chain. Right? So it really takes time. So it's probably likely going to be taking the steps that like what we do, so focusing on 1 or 2 environmental pressures, such as deforestation, water stress, or chemical pollution, and develop a scorecard for each of those issues for the sectors that's relevant, and really build from there. Right? It's okay because I think right now for us as investors, the key is to start asking questions, build a data set, and start gaining insight on these issues for the most prioritized industry sectors. With CSRD in Europe and ISSB globally, it will help to increase the availability of quality data and metrics that will help us ultimately with a scorecard. So now coming down to step 3. Step 3, once you have the scorecard, what do? Engage and evaluate companies on their disclosure, and then identify leaders versus laggards. That's the most important thing, right? It's because in our business, it's about which company we want to partner with versus which companies that we believe are more exposed to risks that could potentially hurt shareholder or bondholder value. So as mentioned earlier, active engagement on nature-related issue is really, really critical. This is not something that you can do by taking a list and tick all the boxes. We're nowhere near that. It is really about working with the portfolio companies on their natural resources use and to really understand the decisions that they take related to risks and opportunity to ensure that there is accountability at the most senior level and that they can improve long-term value creation. What we have seen is that leaders in some of the sectors I mentioned are now changing their business operations to coexist with nature as opposed to just extracting from it. And this is really where opportunity comes in. Because we talk about nature investing, a lot of times we talk about risks, right? But it's not just about risk management. We want to invest in companies that can meaningfully reduce their impact on nature, while at the same time not lose sight of climate transition and adaptation. And we know that there are more and more tangible solutions that we can invest in now to tackle the nature challenge. So it could be products or technologies that help companies to minimize their impact on nature or reduce their dependency. One example I can give you is precision agriculture. We talked about the close interlink between climate mitigation and nature. This is a great example, right? Because in decarbonization, we talk a lot about precision agriculture. It's equally important here in the context of nature conservation. Right? It really helps and allows the farmers to reduce the inputs that's required from natural resources, like water usage, for example, and then also lowering their costs over time. Another type of form of investing is to invest in nature-based solutions directly because of its direct impact on the protection and restoration of nature. A good example here would be investing in sustainable forest management. Not only it helps to sequester carbon and build the resilience of an important natural stock, but it also produces financial return for investors through either timber production or verified carbon credits. And this is something that many investors I know that in the Nordic are very well aware of. So as we come to the end of this presentation, I want to close with a word of optimism. It's so great to see so many of us here today. This means something. It's really exciting to see how so many of us are ready to engage on this topic. When we talk about finance and nature, we should start the conversations from the recognition that finance cannot function without nature, and that our dependency on nature can no longer be ignored. It is totally understandable how changing investment practice to incorporate nature or biodiversity may seem quite daunting and be a challenge for some investors. And it's also totally understandable how the financial industry may feel a bit uncertain about where to start. But the good news is that we're not starting from scratch, because a lot of progress has already been made in policy, as we heard earlier from the Prime Minister, regulation from the central banks, and then also corporate actions, as we just talked about. And what's most important is we don't really have a lot of time to waste. So I believe that now is the time for investors to really turn our capabilities to nature, to put nature investing into practice. And here in Finland today, I urge you to take action, set an example as a leader of this very important effort. Thank you very much.